I want to show you the difference here. If you're on an HDR display, you can 100% see the difference here. And I did take pictures, so we can see those. So if you see here, we're seeing 160 nits peak brightness, which is correct. This is what the SDR version looks like in HDR. This looks super bright to me, but it's only 380 nits. It's not even as bright as the beginning scene. But this sun here is blinding me. This one is not. It just looks like it's actually making everything look gray. Over here, it's looking really bright. I also want to show you what happens if you raise the brightness here, so you can kind of match it to look the same. This is essentially, to me, this looks like what auto HDR is doing. It's something like this by raising that brightness. It's not really what it's doing, but it kind of reminds it. I mean, it looks almost identical when you do that. It's kind of crazy how much you can do. Oh my god. Ah, my eyes. It's clipping for sure. It's kind of crazy to think you can just raise this brightness and it looks very similar. I'm surprised because there shouldn't be that much detail in the SDR one. Yeah, you've lost some detail in these little places, but you're retaining quite a bit of it. Even back here, you're losing some detail compared to over here. But there's still a lot of detail in there if you wanted to raise the brightness of the SDR to match the HDR in this particular scene. And only because this is about half of this one. It's not that far off. It's far off, but it's only about half. Versus some of the games I play where it's significantly higher, and even on my TV, I can get a little bit, just about as bright as my monitor at max peak brightness. And you start to see a lot more differences the higher you go. So I was even able to see the difference between something like 760 or 800 nits versus 930 to 1000 nits. It's very slight, but it's enough to make a difference because there's that much brightness there for you to be able to see it. So let me put this back down so you can see what the SDR looks like. Oh, it's horrible. Ugh. And this isn't even SDR because this is not all gray. Some of this is green in here. And that's because it's not the actual SDR version. The actual SDR version would be a tone map to SDR space of the PNG, which is, I think this one is going to be a tone map of that one. Yeah, there's nothing that's not. Yeah, so this is the tone map. I mean, it just looks awful. I would hate to be in SDR mode watching this video. You're missing out on so much detail. They look similar, but there's no detail here. I feel like it's just a haze on this side of the view. And I've started to get acclimated to seeing this kind of stuff, mainly because I want to see it. I want to know when it's happening. But I've watched enough HDR content and played enough games in HDR that now I'm sensitive to seeing these kinds of things here. I mean, looking at the luminance heat map, it's night and day on this versus this. There's a huge difference. You can see all these little bits of specular highlights that are there that you don't even get at all over here. I mean, you get something going on here, but it's mostly the same brightness level. Hopefully that shows you something, that there is a difference between HDR and SDR. It's a pretty significant difference. It's pretty cool. So I've watched this video anytime I want to test the difference between HDR and SDR and see if it's actually in HDR mode. And this is a great video to do that, this Costa Rica video. Now, I don't want to show you everything because it could be copyrighted, but I just want to show you this picture here to show you the difference that you'll see in HDR or SDR mode. And you can see there is a lot of difference here between these two photos, so long as you're in HDR. If you're watching in SDR, you're probably not going to see very much, if any, difference between these two. But in HDR, you'll definitely see the brightness so much higher on this left side. Now, this is also being tone mapped by Windows 11 to my monitor's reported peak brightness. Not the actual peak brightness, but the reported peak brightness. If I set it to 1000 or something like that, or the 1499 that it would default to otherwise, then you'll get more detail, but I won't. But in this case, I want to have more detail so that I can visually see it. And this peaks around 616 nits or something like that. If I take a screenshot of this, you can see here in this viewer, we can see that the HDR one is peaking at 424 nits and the SDR one is peaking at 160 nits. So there's a lot more detail, and we can even see exactly where that detail is by looking at the luminance heat map. This app here is the HDR WCG Image Viewer, which you can find on the Microsoft Store. And as you can see here, it's really the clouds that have more detail in them from HDR. They've got more brightness, and even the reflections of the cloud down here are showing more in the HDR version versus the SDR version. As you can see here, the yellow is still in the SDR space, but it's over 100 nits, so it's in the 160 nit space where you're getting some yellow there. So that can display in a regular SDR display, but everything else out here is going to give a lot more detail. If we look at what's called Draw SDR as grayscale, this picture on the right should all be 100% grayscale. There's a little bit of color in the clouds here, so I don't know what they're considering SDR in this app, because there's a few bits here that are, this is clearly an SDR image, but it's in HDR mode being tone mapped down anyway to SDR, so some of this might even be outside of the SDR range. Not 100% sure. But what you can see here is you can see exactly what is colored that is in HDR. So some of these leaves here and stuff, these tree bits here, even over here, some of these little tree leaves, if you can see them, are in HDR. And if you look down here, definitely most of the reflection here is in HDR. Lots of the clouds in the sky. It's a completely different image than you would get when in SDR. And so this is a very good comparison between the two. Just a quick comparison to show you the difference between HDR and not HDR. But you can only see that if you're on a device that is HDR capable. My phone is HDR capable. It's a Samsung Galaxy phone, it has HDR, and you can see this difference on the phone. There are other devices like monitors that you can do it, but you have to enable HDR in Windows prior to doing it. The reason I was able to do this is I first loaded a video with HDR enabled, then I disabled HDR, loaded it again, and then re-enabled HDR so that I could see it correctly. And then that's how I was able to tell the difference. If you look down here on the bottom, you can see this says HDR on the settings here, and then this one says 4K only. So 4K doesn't necessarily mean HDR or anything, those are completely different things. And if you go back to that Chrome window over here, you can see that all of these options have HDR written on them, whereas in this one over here, none of them have HDR written on them. They're exactly the same options, but there's no HDR, which means YouTube has tone mapped this video down to SDR from HDR. It's honestly a really good tone mapping. It looks really good, but it's nothing like actual native HDR. Okay, I hope you learned something there. You got something out of this video. I'm really trying to show off the differences between HDR and not HDR. For me, HDR is one of those things where I will get it. It's one of those things where I will buy screens now for HDR. I will buy something because it has HDR, because it is that much better than SDR. Now, HDR 400, I'm not sure, but my monitor has 600, HDR 600 VESA certification. It's an LCD, so there are limitations to it. It does raise the black levels, but in a reasonably lit room, you can't really tell. You can only tell when you're playing a game that's extremely dark. I'm talking extremely, I'm not talking about like neon lights everywhere. I'm talking 100% dark. There's like a very little bit of light in it. There was one game I played like that, and it looked really awful. It's something I definitely would rather watch on my OLED. But even with this HDR 600, everyone says you need 1000 nits just for it to look good. Yeah, that's what everybody says, but I think it looks good even without 1000 nits. If you're on an HDR screen right now, it's probably not a 1000 nit screen, let me tell you. Even OLEDs don't get to 1000 nits. The only reason they're so much better is because they have what people call infinite contrast, because the blacks are actually black. That's the only difference. The other benefit of an LCD over an OLED for HDR is that the full scene brightness is the exact same in a lot of cases. Not always. In a lot of cases, the full scene brightness is the same peak nits brightness as 10%. So normally when you talk about, oh, you know, OLEDs can get to 700 or 900 and whatever nits peak brightness, that's at 10% of the screen being in HDR. This scene has more than 10% of it in HDR, but not all of it is at that peak brightness value either. But if more than 10% of the screen is at a high peak brightness, it will lower that value. On an OLED, at least my LG C1 OLED, it's at 160 nits. So it's in SDR. This is how bright it gets when the full scene is in HDR. Whereas on my LCD, I can get 740, 760 nits peak brightness on my monitor if the entire scene is at peak brightness. So there are definitely benefits to having an LCD for those cases, especially for colorful videos like this, where there aren't that many dark areas. It looks amazing in HDR. It's only that one time I was playing that game where I had an issue. Typically, I can play pretty much anything, and it looks really good on this screen, even though it's only HDR 600 certified. I wouldn't listen to those people. They call it, you know, maybe when you get into like the 300 range, 300 nits or 400 nits, it doesn't look as good. But with Windows 11, it really does fix a lot of things. So here's another thing, is that I'm on Windows 11, and this is being tone mapped to my display's peak brightness. It will not let it go over 600 nits peak brightness, because that is what my display is reporting to Windows. I can change that by going into the configuration using a tool called Custom Resolution Utility that hasn't been updated in years. If I use that, I can go in and change the ED-ID data for my monitor and set it so that the peak brightness is higher than what it's actually reporting to Windows, because it can do higher peak brightness. It's just not reporting that because the VESA standard is saying 600, that's what it's going to report to Windows 11. There's a lot of things here to keep in mind, but I really, really do like HDR. I think it is drastically changed how I look at things. And on top of that, when you add ray tracing for games, it is really phenomenal to look at. But the HDR needs to come first. I think that is the first step in getting a next generation gaming experience, or even just a video experience. Seeing things in HDR really changes things. It's so much better. This is so pale and just dull and dark. And then you look over here, it looks amazing. And I feel like I'm showing one of those demos where they show, oh, HDR and not HDR. Now the SDR version typically does look better in SDR mode, but not that much better. You can still tell it's SDR. I can do one more showing here. So these are completely different. I'll take a screenshot again because this looks like it could be clipping. It's not clipping, but it looks like it could be. So we take the screenshot and we take a look at those. And you can see here that this one's saying it peaks at 340 nits and this one's peaking at 160 nits. Now I did find a weird issue with this app. When you open a file in full screen, it shows different than if you open it sometimes in a window, but I'm getting the same results this time. So I'm not seeing any difference there. And it is reporting my peak brightness as 603 nits. This is really cool to see the difference here. You can see how much of a difference there is between these two sides just by looking at this. The sun is just not giving the brightness, but over here it really seems like the sun is in the monitor. It's showing it to me. And if you look here at the luminance heat map again, you can see how much more detail you're going to see in the sky because there's more information there. There's more luminance data. Even on the rocks here, they're a little bit brighter in this HDR version than the SDR tone map. Now, if you're wondering why you're seeing some stuff here, like I said, it's running the SDR version in HDR in Windows. Now, if you really want to see what it looks like in SDR, you would look at the PNG output that was made. And these should look identical. So you can see these two should look identical, but this one's a little brighter. It's not reporting the peak brightness, but this one was tone mapped from the HDR. This is tone mapped from the SDR. This is still brighter, but it's a PNG, meaning it's not the HDR output. But this is really what it would look like if you want to test it. Because if I look at the SDR grayscale, yeah, here you're getting 100%. And if I look at the HDR tone map version, so this is the HDR one where the Microsoft Xbox game bar has tone mapped it to SDR. So when I'm taking screenshots, I'm holding Windows key Alt and print screen in Windows 11. You can do this in Windows 10, but I don't know if that hotkey works. I'm actually pretty sure it does, because I did take HDR screenshots in Windows 10 before. When you take those screenshots, the Xbox game bar is what's doing it, and that's the only thing that, as far as I know, that can take HDR screenshots. It takes them as JXR format, which is JPEG XR. It's a special kind of JPEG format that is part of the standard and has been around for a while. It's just not been used by anyone up until recently when Microsoft added it. This is really what you're going to look at when you're comparing HDR to SDR, is you're going to see something like this. So this is the SDR space shown as grayscale. And now you're seeing it should be 100% grayscale. It is now 100% grayscale. And if you look over here, most of it is in color because most of it is HDR and not SDR. Even here, these reflections on the rocks, you can see some color in there. This is a huge difference. It's phenomenal, just the way the sun looks. I mean, this looks pretty good. Your eyes will adjust. Your eyes will typically watch SDR content and not realize how dark it is. But when I've played games in the past, I've just looked at games and thought, man, this is so dull and dark. I can't see it correctly. I've tried raising my monitor brightness to make it easier to see. I've tried a bunch of different tricks until I got to HDR and tried it. And then I said, oh, that's why everything always looks so dull and dark to me. It was partially because I'm an LCD, but it's because HDR wasn't there. There was all this extra information in the game that I wasn't seeing. And if you're thinking, well, the game's not actually HDR, it was meant for SDR, blah, blah, blah. No, most of these game engines are actually at HDR internally. And what you see is an LDR, low dynamic range version output from the game engine for your display. It is not actually the correct colors that you would have seen had you seen the 16-bit color data inside of the game. Yeah, this completely changes the way that you look at things when you see what SDR version of an image compared to an HDR version of an image. There's just so much more detail. Although, yes, this is pretty convincing. This actually looks pretty good because it is the tone map of this version. This HDR version. It looks very convincing, but not that good. Once you look at this sun area, there's all this orange and everything. It's just gone. It's dull, dark, not as nice. Thanks very much for watching this, and hopefully you got something out of it. Thank you very much. Subscribe, like the video.